When I was struggling, they didn't ask what I needed. They told me what they'd handle. At the time, it felt like relief. The kind that loosens your shoulders before you even realize how tense you've been. I had been drowning quietly. Bills stacking up, decisions piling on top of each other. My mind too crowded to think clearly. I hadn't told many people. I didn't want pity, and I definitely didn't want advice. But family notices things you don't say out loud. They showed up one afternoon with concern written carefully across their face. Not panic, not judgment, calm confidence. The kind that sounds like stability when you're unsure of yourself. "Let me help," they said. "Just for now." They talked about experience, about how they'd handled finances before, about how stress clouds judgment, and how family is supposed to step in when things get heavy. They didn't pressure me, at least not directly. They framed it as common sense. Why struggle alone when I can take this off your plate? I hesitated, not because I didn't trust them, but because something in me wanted to stay involved. I asked questions. They smiled and answered smoothly. Too smoothly, maybe, but I ignored that thought as exhaustion talking. They didn't offer advice. They offered solutions. Joint access. Temporary oversight. Just until you're back on your feet. Those words mattered to me. Temporary. Together. Family. I remember signing the first document without reading it carefully. My hands were tired. My mind even more so. I told myself I'd go over everything later when things were calmer, when I could breathe again. They reassured me constantly. Checked in often. Paid bills on time. Sent screenshots of balances. Everything looked fine. Better than fine. Organized. Controlled. And slowly, without realizing it, I stopped checking. That was the real shift. Not the paperwork. Not the accounts. It was the moment I handed over attention along with responsibility. I told myself this was what support looked like, that I was lucky to have someone who cared enough to step up, that family wouldn't take advantage of family. What I didn't understand then was how easy it is for help to become habit, and for habit to become authority. By the time I realized something felt different, the offer had already turned into a structure, and I was standing inside it. At first, nothing felt wrong. In fact, things felt easier. The kind of easy that makes you grateful enough not to ask questions. Bills were paid before I remembered them. Appointments were scheduled without my prompting. Messages came in with updates I hadn't requested, but didn't mind receiving. Handled. Already taken care of. Don't worry about it. Those phrases became common, almost comforting. They sounded like competence, like care. Whenever I asked about something specific, a charge I didn't recognize, a transfer that felt unfamiliar, the explanation came quickly, wrapped in reassurance. It's just temporary. I move things around to keep you safe. You don't need to stress about the details. And I let it go, not because I didn't care, but because I was tired of caring. I wanted to believe someone else could hold the weight for a while. The first real change wasn't financial. It was conversational. When money came up, the tone shifted. My questions were met with patience that felt instructional, like I was being guided, not consulted. I know this stuff can be overwhelming. Trust me, this is better for you. Better for me, not with me. I noticed they started speaking on my behalf. To the bank, to service providers, even to other relatives. Decisions were already made by the time I heard about them. If I hesitated, they'd laugh softly and say, "You asked for help, remember?" That sentence stayed with me, because I hadn't asked for control. I'd asked for support. Still, I didn't push back. Every time doubt surfaced, guilt followed. This was family. They were giving their time, their energy. Questioning them felt ungrateful, almost disloyal. So I adapted. I stopped asking as many questions. I waited for updates instead of initiating conversations. I let weeks pass without checking my own accounts because I was told everything was handled. And the more I stepped back, the more space they stepped into. They started suggesting limits. Budgets I hadn't agreed to. Purchases that needed approval. Transfers that required discussion. When I finally noticed that I had to ask before spending my own money, I told myself it was temporary discipline. A reset. Something responsible adults did when things got messy. But responsibility doesn't remove your voice. And one afternoon, when I tried to access an account and couldn't, when the screen loaded and reloaded before locking me out, a thought landed heavily in my chest. This wasn't support anymore. It was structure, and I hadn't built it. The screen refreshed twice before the message appeared. Access denied. I stared at it longer than I should have, waiting for it to change, as if the words might soften if I didn't react too quickly. I told myself it was a glitch, a system error, something simple that would resolve itself in a few minutes. Still, my chest tightened. I tried again. Same result. That was when I reached for my phone and sent a casual message, pretending I wasn't already uneasy. "Hey, I can't log into the account. Is there an issue?" The reply came faster than expected. "Oh, yeah, I adjusted the permissions. Just for security. I didn't want you stressing over it." Security. Stress. The same words, rearranged. I typed back slowly, choosing each word carefully. "I just wanted to check something." A pause. Then, "I've got it covered. Trust me." That should have reassured me. It used to, but this time, something felt off, not sharp enough to accuse, but heavy enough to sit with me. I replayed the past few months in my head. The moments I dismissed. The way decisions arrived, already finalized. How often I'd been told not to worry instead of being asked what I thought. I opened my email and searched for old statements, digging through months of messages I'd stopped reading closely. At first, everything looked normal. Then I noticed small things. Transfers that happened earlier than expected. Amounts rounded in ways I didn't recognize. Notes that said internal adjustment. Nothing illegal. Nothing obvious. Just unfamiliar. When I asked about one of the transfers later that evening, they smiled. The same calm smile I come to associate with reassurance. "It's nothing," they said. "I moved it to protect you from overdrafts." I nodded, but my stomach didn't. Because protection doesn't remove access. It explains. It asks. It includes. That night, I barely slept. Not because I thought I was being robbed, but because I couldn't tell where the line was anymore, where my responsibility ended and theirs began, and why that line seemed to keep moving without my consent. The next day, I tried to set a boundary, gently. "I'd like to be more involved again," I said. "Even if you're handling things, I want visibility." The reaction was subtle, but immediate. A tightening around the eyes. A breath held a fraction too long. "Of course," they replied, "but you have to trust the process." The process. Not me. Not us. Later, when I asked for full access again, the answer changed. "Let's wait until things stabilize. It's better this way for now. You don't want to undo progress." Progress toward what? That was the moment doubt turned into awareness. I wasn't being helped through a crisis. I was being guided into a position where resistance would feel unreasonable, even selfish. And the most unsettling part was this. They truly believed they were doing the right thing, which meant if I wanted my life back, I couldn't rely on confrontation. I would need proof, patience, and a plan. And for the first time since this began, I stopped feeling overwhelmed. I felt alert. Once I stopped pushing back, everything became clearer. I nodded more, asked fewer questions, let conversations end when they wanted them to. On the surface, I looked compliant, grateful, even. Inside, I was watching everything. Patterns started to emerge. Money moved on a schedule I hadn't agreed to. Payments were prioritized in ways that benefited convenience, not necessity. When I asked about certain expenses, the explanations grew shorter, less patient. "You don't need to worry about that one. It's handled." Handled had become a wall. I began keeping my own records. Nothing dramatic, just screenshots, dates, notes written quietly in a folder no one knew about. I compared what I was told with what I could still see. The gaps were small but consistent. Small gaps add up. What disturbed me most wasn't the money itself. It was how confidently my absence was assumed. Meetings were scheduled without me. Decisions were explained after the fact. My role in my own life was slowly being reduced to acknowledgement. I realized something uncomfortable then. Control works best when it feels reasonable. They never raised their voice, never demanded anything outright. They framed every decision as protection, every restriction as responsibility. And because they wore the mask concern so well, it became hard to object without sounding ungrateful. That was the design. I tested it once, carefully. I asked to make a purchase I didn't need, something small, symbolic. The answer came back measured and calm. Let's talk about that later. Later never came. Instead, I received a message the next morning outlining a revised budget. No discussion, just information. That's when I understood how far things had shifted. My autonomy hadn't been taken from me all at once. It had been replaced, piece by piece, with permission. That night, I reached out to someone outside the family for the first time. Not to accuse, just to ask questions. Neutral ones, hypothetical ones. Their response was immediate and careful. Be very patient, they said, and don't tip your hand. That advice stayed with me, because by then I knew something important. If I moved too fast, I'd be framed as unstable. If I got emotional, I'd lose credibility. Control doesn't panic. It waits. So I waited too. I listened more than I spoke. I agreed more than I resisted. And while they believed the structure was holding me in place, I was learning every beam, every joint, every weak point. They thought I had gone quiet because I was dependent. They didn't realize I had gone quiet because I was preparing. The moment everything became undeniable didn't arrive with drama. It arrived quietly, buried in a routine email I almost deleted without reading. It was a notification from the bank, a generic message about an account update. Normally, I wouldn't have paid attention. Those messages had blended into the background ever since I stopped managing things directly. But something about the wording felt different. Authorized user changes completed. My stomach dropped. I clicked through, navigating carefully, afraid that even looking too closely might alert someone. The details were limited, but clear enough to understand what had happened. I wasn't just restricted anymore. I had been reclassified. My role had shifted from owner to participant. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, replaying every conversation that had led to this point, every reassurance, every just for now, every time I'd been told not to worry. It was all connected. Later that day, I asked about it, calmly, as if I already knew the answer. Oh, that, they said lightly. It just makes things smoother. Less confusion. Less confusion for who? They explained it like a technical adjustment, something administrative. They even framed it as a favor, a way to prevent mistakes while I focus on recovery. Recovery from what? I wasn't sure anymore. What struck me wasn't the explanation. It was the confidence, the assumption that I'd accept it because I always had, because I'd been trained to associate questioning with instability. That's when I felt it fully. Not fear, certainty. This wasn't temporary support that had gone too far. It was a deliberate shift of power, executed slowly enough that resistance would feel unreasonable. That night, I reviewed everything I'd documented so far. Screenshots, messages, dates. The pattern was undeniable now. The help had come with an expiration date. Mine. I reached out again to the person outside the family, this time with specifics. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't speculate. I just presented facts. Their response was measured, but firm. This can be reversed, they said, but only if you move quietly. That sentence changed everything. For the first time since this began, I wasn't reacting control. I was planning around it. I stopped thinking in terms of fairness or family expectations. I started thinking in terms of leverage, process, timing. They still believed they were managing a situation. They didn't know they had revealed their endgame too soon. And once you see the endgame clearly, the rules change. From that point on, I wasn't waiting to be helped. I was waiting for the right moment to take back what had always been mine. Once I understood the full scope of what had been done, urgency stopped being useful. Panic would only confirm the story they were already prepared to tell, that I was overwhelmed, emotional, incapable of managing complexity. That narrative had been building quietly for months, reinforced every time I stepped back and let them handle it. So I did the opposite of what my instincts wanted. I slowed down. I thanked them more often, asked for fewer explanations, let them believe their system was working exactly as intended. I made myself smaller on the surface, so I could think more clearly underneath. That was the hardest part, because there's a specific kind of frustration that comes from being aware of control, but pretending you're not. Every update felt like a reminder. Every cheerful message about progress felt like a test of my restraint. But restraint was a strategy. Behind the scenes, I rebuilt quietly. I opened an independent account under my name alone. I redirected small, legitimate sources of income. Nothing suspicious, nothing that would trigger concern. I reestablished my credit step by step, careful not to move faster than my circumstances justified. I also gathered advice, but selectively. Not everyone needed to know. I spoke to people who understood systems, not emotions. People who had no stake in family dynamics and no patience for manipulation disguised as care. They helped me map options, not outcomes. What could be reversed? What required consent? What relied on assumption rather than authority? And slowly, the picture changed. I learned that many of the controls placed over my finances were only strong because no one had challenged them. They relied on inertia, on the idea that I wouldn't push back because family ties made it awkward. Awkward is not a legal defense. Every week, I reviewed what I could see and compared it with what I was told. The discrepancies weren't dramatic, but they were consistent. That consistency mattered. It showed intent. Meanwhile, they grew more comfortable. Their language shifted. Less reassurance, more instruction. They talked about long-term plans, as if my future had already been delegated. They mentioned investments I hadn't approved, goals I hadn't set. They believed the story was over. That belief made them careless. I noticed delays in responses, assumptions that I'd agree before being asked, confidence that bordered on entitlement. That's when I knew timing was on my side. Control depends on certainty, the certainty that the other person won't resist. The moment that certainty cracks, everything changes. I didn't need to expose them. I didn't need to confront them. I just needed to be ready. Because when power is taken quietly, it can be reclaimed the same way. And when that moment came, I intended to make sure it didn't come with a warning. The mistake they made was a small one. So small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone still reacting emotionally instead of watching strategically. It didn't look like greed or malice. It looked like efficiency, one extra step taken without explanation. They consolidated accounts. On paper, it made sense. Fewer moving parts, easier oversight, better tracking. They framed it as progress, sent a brief message, and moved on as if consent were implied. But that single action did something important. It created a trail. Before, the control was spread out, layered across permissions, temporary access, informal authority. Hard to challenge because it was vague. Now it was centralized, clear, documented, and documentation is leverage. I waited 2 days before asking about it. When I did, I kept my tone neutral. Just wanted to understand how that works. They explained it confidently, walking me through the benefits, using language they'd used many times before. Protection, stability, long-term thinking. They never once asked if I agreed. That omission mattered. I forwarded the explanation, along with screenshots, to the advisor who had been guiding me quietly. The response came back measured, almost calm. This is the opening. They explained that consolidation changed the rules. It tied authority to specific actions instead of assumed roles. It also increased scrutiny from institutions that cared nothing about family dynamics. Systems don't respect intention. They respect procedure. Over the next few days, I moved carefully. I didn't rush to reverse anything. Instead, I requested information, formally in writing, statements, records, clarifications. Each request was reasonable on its own. Together, they created pressure. I could feel it in the delays, the longer response times, the slight defensiveness creeping into their tone. You don't need all this. Why now? Why now was the wrong question, because now was when everything was finally visible. One response included an attachment they didn't mean to send, an internal note referencing decisions made without my approval. Nothing dramatic, just phrasing that assumed ownership rather than stewardship. That was enough. I sent it to my advisor without comment. They replied with one sentence. This confirmed standing. From there, the steps were clear, not aggressive, not emotional, procedural. I initiated a review through the proper channels, not an accusation, a request for verification, a simple check to ensure records matched ownership. Institutions take those requests seriously, and once they do, control changes hands very quickly. Throughout all of this, I stayed calm, polite, cooperative. I didn't let my behavior signal anything was wrong, because the moment control feels threatened, it tightens. I needed it relaxed. They still believed they were in charge. They didn't realize the structure they'd built for me was about to work in my favor. And when it did, it wouldn't look like revenge. It would look like correction. The change didn't announce itself. It slipped in quietly, the way control always does when it's being reclaimed. For days after I initiated the review, nothing happened. No confrontation. No dramatic phone call. Just a subtle pause in a rhythm I'd grown used to. Messages stopped arriving. Updates didn't come. The constant presence I lived under suddenly felt distant. That absence was telling. When an institution steps in, everyone becomes careful. Authority that once felt automatic now has to justify itself, and justification takes time. The first official response I received wasn't emotional or accusatory. It was procedural, a confirmation, a timeline, a list of documents to be reviewed. No one asked how I felt. No one questioned my intentions. They only wanted to know one thing: who actually held ownership. That distinction mattered. When my relative finally reached out, their tone had changed. Not hostile, not warm either, just uncertain. "Is everything okay?" they asked. I noticed some delays. I answered carefully. "I'm just making sure things are structured correctly." Structured correctly. It was a neutral phrase, but it landed differently. I could feel it. The confidence they once carried had softened into caution. Over the next few days, small things began to shift. I was contacted directly about decisions that used to be made without me. Permissions were requested instead of assumed. Statements were sent to my email instead of theirs. None of it was dramatic, but every change restored a piece of ground I hadn't realized I'd lost. I could tell they were adjusting too, repositioning themselves as supportive again, emphasizing teamwork, reminding me how much they'd done to help. The narrative was changing. That told me everything. People who are genuinely helping don't rewrite the story when oversight appears. They don't need to. Their actions hold up on their own. But when control is exposed to light, it reshapes itself quickly. By the end of the week, I had access I hadn't had in months. Clear records, full visibility. The structure that once felt unmovable now felt provisional, dependent on verification instead of assumption. I didn't relax, because I knew something important. Control rarely disappears without resistance, and the closer it gets to slipping away, the tighter it tries to hold on. Whatever came next wouldn't be quiet, but this time I wouldn't be caught inside it. It came sooner than I expected, not as anger, but as urgency, masked with concern. A sudden need to talk things through. A call placed late in the evening, when people are more likely to agree just to end the conversation. I let it ring once before answering. They didn't waste time. "I feel like things are getting complicated," they said. "We were doing so well. I just don't want this to turn into something unnecessary." Unnecessary. Another careful word. They spoke about family, about trust, about how outside involvement could create problems that didn't need to exist. Their voice stayed calm, but underneath it was pressure, the kind that asks you to step back without saying so. I listened without interrupting. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice steady. "I'm not changing anything," I said. "I'm just making sure everything is correct." There was a pause. They tried a different angle next. "Guilt. You know I've only ever done this to protect you. I put my own time and energy into this." That was true and irrelevant. Protection doesn't require ownership. Effort doesn't justify control. When I didn't respond the way they expected, the tone shifted again, not sharp, but strained. Do you even understand how much pressure this puts on me? There it was. The moment the focus moved away from my well-being and toward their discomfort, I let the silence stretch before answering. I didn't ask you to carry it alone, I said, and I didn't agree to give up access. That line landed harder than anything else I could have said, because it wasn't emotional. It wasn't accusatory. It was factual. They regrouped quickly, suggesting compromises, temporary delays, joint approvals, anything that would keep their hand on the wheel a little longer. I didn't argue. I didn't negotiate. I'm comfortable letting the process finish, I said. That ended the conversation. After we hung up, I sat quietly, feeling the aftershock of it. Not fear relief, because for the first time, I hadn't been pulled back into the narrative. I hadn't been framed as confused or incapable. I had stayed present. The next morning, I received confirmation that the review was nearing completion. More access restored. More permissions shifted back to me. The pushback had come. It hadn't worked. And that told me the balance had already tipped. Control was no longer assumed. It was being defended. And defenses only appear when power is slipping away. The confirmation arrived early in the morning, quiet and unmistakable. Access restored. Those two words changed the air in the room. Not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because the direction had finally reversed. What had been taken slowly was coming back the same way, step by step, through process rather than confrontation. I logged in without resistance this time. No errors, no restrictions, full visibility. Every account, every movement, laid out without commentary or interpretation. Facts instead of framing. I didn't feel triumph. I felt steadiness. Later that day, I received another message, this one carefully worded. The review was complete. Authority had been clarified. Any actions moving forward would require my direct consent. Mine. I noticed they didn't call. The silence said more than any argument could have. When control disappears, so does certainty. The confidence they once carried had no place to stand anymore. When we did speak later, it was different. Their voice was measured, cautious. They asked instead of told, suggested instead of decided. I just want what's best for you, they said. I believe they believed that. But belief doesn't override boundaries. I thanked them for the help they provided and made one thing clear. From this point on, I will be managing my own affairs. Support was welcome. Authority was not. They didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. Over the next few days, I restructured everything quietly. Permissions reset. Access limited. Documentation updated. Nothing vindictive. Nothing dramatic. Just ownership reestablished. What surprised me most was how calm it felt. No surge of emotion. No urge to explain myself to anyone else in the family. I didn't need witnesses. I didn't need validation. I had control again, and that was enough. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. Not because the situation was perfect, but because it was mine again. And once that truth settled in, I understood something clearly. Power doesn't always announce itself when it's taken back. Sometimes, it just returns quietly to the person it belonged to all along. I didn't celebrate publicly or privately. I simply continued forward, careful and deliberate. Regaining control wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about restoring balance, dignity, and responsibility to the place they had quietly been removed from, without noise, anger, or permission from others at Lassamy. The aftermath wasn't loud. It didn't echo through the family or arrive with dramatic confrontations. It unfolded quietly in the space where control had once lived and now no longer did. Days passed, then weeks. Communication became polite, but distant. Updates were no longer sent automatically. Advice was offered cautiously, like someone stepping onto unfamiliar ground. That was fine with me. I noticed how much lighter things felt when decisions were mine again. Even difficult choices carried less weight when they belonged to me. Responsibility, I realized, is only heavy when it's paired with powerlessness. Some relatives sense a shift. Questions were asked gently, indirectly. I didn't explain. I didn't offend myself. I simply said everything was handled, because it was. What surprised me most was how quickly the narrative lost momentum once control was gone. There was no villain to warn people about, no crisis to manage. Without authority, concern lost its urgency. That's when I understood something important. Control feeds on relevance. When it disappears, so does a need to justify it. I rebuilt steadily, not just financially, but internally. I stopped second-guessing my instincts. I trusted my ability to learn, to adapt, to correct mistakes without handing the steering wheel to someone else. Mistakes felt less dangerous when they were mine. I also changed how I accepted help. I asked clearer questions, set clearer boundaries. I noticed when support came with conditions attached and stepped back before habit could form again. That awareness was worth everything I'd gone through. The relationship didn't end completely. It changed shape. Distance replaced authority. Politeness replaced certainty. And that was healthier than anything we'd had before. They never apologized. I didn't need them to. Closure doesn't come from acknowledgement. It comes from alignment. When your life starts responding to your choices instead of someone else's intentions. I no longer felt like I was recovering from something. I felt like I was moving forward. Quietly, deliberately. And if there was one lasting lesson, it was this. Support that requires surrender isn't support. It's ownership pretending to be care. I didn't reclaim my life in a single moment. I reclaimed it the same way it had been taken. Slowly, patiently, and without asking permission. That made all the difference. Once things settled, I had time to think about what had really happened. Not just the actions, but the mechanics behind them. Power doesn't arrive the way we expect. It rarely announces itself. It doesn't always come with threats or raised voices. More often, it arrives wrapped in responsibility, disguised as concern, justified by competence. That's what makes it hard to recognize. I replayed the early days in my mind, searching for the exact moment I could have stopped it sooner. But there wasn't one clear turning point. There were dozens of small ones. Each time I stayed silent to keep the peace. Each time I accepted help without defining limits. Each time I told myself it was temporary. Control didn't replace my authority overnight. It inherited it. And I handed it over because I thought that was what being supported looked like. That realization wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. It forced me to look at my own role without blame or shame. I wasn't careless. I was overwhelmed. And when you're overwhelmed, certainty feels like safety, even when it comes from someone else. Especially then. What I understand now is that real support doesn't rush you into decisions. It doesn't centralize power in the name of efficiency. It doesn't treat your silence as consent. Real support stays transparent. It checks in. It makes room for your questions, even when those questions slow things down. Anything else is just management. I also learned how easily family dynamics blur boundaries. History creates shortcuts. Assumptions replace agreements. Love becomes a justification instead of a safeguard. That's dangerous territory. Because family knows where your defenses are lowest. They know how to speak your language. They know which words carry the most weight. That doesn't make them villains. It makes boundaries essential. I stopped believing that setting limits meant rejecting help. I started seeing it as defining the terms under which help could exist. The difference between collaboration and control is consent. Clear, ongoing consent. And consent isn't something you give once. It's something you maintain. I rebuilt my systems with that in mind. Separate access, clear documentation, regular reviews. Not because I expect a betrayal again, but because clarity prevents it. Structure, when chosen freely, creates safety without surrender. Emotionally, something shifted too. I no longer equated gratitude with obedience. I learned that appreciation doesn't require compliance. You can be thankful and still say no. You can accept help without giving up authorship of your life. That lesson changed how I show up everywhere. In relationships, in work, in decisions that affect my future. I'm more deliberate now, slower to hand things over, more willing to sit with discomfort rather than outsource it. Because discomfort passes. Loss of agency lingers. What happened to me wasn't unique. It happens quietly, every day, to people who trust deeply and need help at the same time. The story isn't about money. It never was. It's about ownership of your voice, your choices, your direction. And once you understand how power actually works, you stop fearing it. You learn how to hold it without gripping too tightly and without letting it slip away unnoticed.
Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges. Not by erasing them, but by teaching you how to run your hand across them without bleeding. Months passed after everything settled. The company moved forward under its new structure. The people involved adapted, some faster than others. From the outside, it probably looked like a simple business recovery story. No one would ever guess what it cost. I rarely thought about that night anymore. The table, the silence, the door closing behind me. Not because it stopped mattering, but because it stopped controlling the narrative in my head. Memory changes when it no longer defines you. Occasionally, someone new at work would ask how I got here, where I started, what pushed me toward this path. They expected a clean story, a mentor, a lucky break. I usually kept it vague. Struggle doesn't always translate well to people who haven't lived it. What I didn't tell them was that the most important thing I gained wasn't skill or leverage or control. It was restraint. There were moments, quiet ones, where I could have pressed harder, taken more, exposed weaknesses publicly, forced apologies instead of allowing realizations to surface naturally. I chose not to, not because I was merciful, but because domination fades faster than discipline. Power that relies on humiliation is temporary. Power that relies on structure lasts. One evening, long after the workday ended, I found myself standing in an empty conference room, lights dimmed, city glowing outside the windows. The reflection staring back at me in the glass looked unfamiliar. Not because I'd changed too much, but because I'd finally stopped carrying the version of myself that needed approval. That was the real return. Not to a family, not to a company, but to myself. I understood something then that I hadn't before. Being cast out wasn't the wound. Believing I needed to be let back in was. Once that belief died, everything else fell into place. Some people still assume this story is about revenge. It isn't. Revenge would have kept me tied to them emotionally, dependent on their reaction for closure. This was about sovereignty, about deciding my value without consensus, about walking away without bitterness because I no longer needed the past to validate the present. I don't know what they say about me now. I don't ask. It doesn't matter. What matters is this. When they erased me, they thought they were ending something. They were starting it. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of it, it's this. Sometimes the greatest advantage you'll ever have is being underestimated long enough to decide who you really want to become. There are moments in life that feel bigger while you're living them. This wasn't one of those moments. The lesson came quietly, long after everything else had settled. No confrontation. No dramatic realization. Just a simple understanding that arrived without asking permission. I was reviewing a new proposal when I caught myself smiling. Not because it was impressive, but because I recognized the pattern immediately. Overconfidence wrapped in polished language. Risk hidden behind reputation. A belief that history alone could guarantee the future. I closed the file. I'd seen this before. Years ago, I would have doubted myself, questioned my instincts, deferred to someone else's authority. That version of me wouldn't have trusted his own judgment. This one did. That's when it finally clicked. The real transformation had nothing to do with success or position. It was internal. I no longer needed someone else to confirm what I saw. I no longer waited for permission to trust my own analysis. Being erased had forced me to build something sturdier than approval. It had forced me to build conviction. I thought about my uncle then, about how certain he'd been that night at the table, how confident authority had made him. He hadn't been cruel, just careless with power. Carelessness looks harmless until it costs someone everything. That awareness stayed with me as I moved forward. In meetings, in decisions, in the way I treated people whose voices were easy to overlook. I made a rule for myself. Never dismiss someone simply because they're inconvenient. Never confuse silence for insignificance. Because I know what happens when you do. The story didn't end with a dramatic victory or a public reckoning. It ended with something better: control over my own direction. I didn't reclaim a seat at their table. I built my own. One where decisions were made carefully, where trust was supported by verification, where people weren't erased because it was easier than asking hard questions. And when I look back now, I don't feel anger. I feel clarity. Being cast out didn't break me. It refined me. It showed me what power really is, not the ability to exclude, but the discipline to include wisely. Not the confidence to dominate, but the patience to prepare. Some stories end with revenge. This one ends with independence. And that lesson, the last one, is the only ending I ever needed.
What remained after everything wasn't suspicion or resentment. It was awareness. I noticed it in small moments, when someone offered help and I paused instead of agreeing immediately, when advice came quickly and I asked a follow-up question instead of nodding, when decisions took longer because I stayed present inside them. That pause became my anchor. I didn't lose the ability to trust. I refined it. Trust stopped being something I handed over wholesale and became something I built gradually, with clarity and mutual respect. I learned that trust and boundaries aren't opposites. They're partners. Without boundaries, trust becomes exposure. Without trust, boundaries become walls. The balance between them is where healthy relationships live. I also stopped confusing discomfort with danger. Letting someone else take control had felt comforting when I was overwhelmed, but it came at a cost I didn't recognize until later. Now, when something feels uncomfortable, I sit with it. I ask whether it's challenging me or replacing me. That distinction matters. Looking back, I don't see myself as someone who was taken advantage of. I see someone who was learning how easily authority can shift when responsibility is shared without structure, learning how quickly care can turn into control when no one defines the limits. Those lessons stay with you. They show up in how you negotiate, how you listen, how you protect your time and energy. They shape the way you say yes, and more importantly, how you say no. The relationship that once defined so much of my stress no longer defines anything. It exists in a smaller, quieter form. Civil, distant, appropriate. It doesn't demand anything from me, and I don't offer more than I choose. That feels right. I didn't need an apology to move forward. I needed alignment between my life and my values. Once that was restored, everything else adjusted naturally. There's a calm that comes from knowing no one else is steering your decisions behind the scenes. No one monitoring, redirecting, or quietly assuming authority over your future. That calm is earned, and is protected by vigilance, not fear. If there's a final truth I carry from this experience, it's this: help should never make you smaller. Support should never require silence. And family, no matter how well-intentioned, does not get automatic ownership over your life. I'm not guarded now. I'm grounded. And from that place, everything I build going forward belongs fully to me, by choice, by clarity, and by right. The final truth of this story isn't about betrayal, money, or even control. It's about authorship, about who gets to decide the shape of your life when circumstances become difficult and fear makes certainty tempting. For a long time, I believed strength meant accepting help without question. I thought independence was something you returned to once things stabilized. I didn't realize that independence is something you protect, especially when you're vulnerable. What happened taught me that power is rarely taken by force. It's borrowed, invited, and normalized. It grows in the absence of clarity and thrives where silence replaces consent. By the time you notice it, it already feels established. Reclaiming it doesn't require drama. It requires presence. It requires paying attention to what feels off before you can explain why. It requires slowing down when someone rushes you for your own good. It requires remembering that gratitude does not cancel your right to participate. I didn't become stronger by fighting. I became stronger by choosing involvement over relief, by asking questions even when they made things uncomfortable, by staying awake inside my own decisions. That choice reshaped everything. I no longer fear needing help. I fear giving it the wrong shape. I fear confusing care with control, efficiency with authority, concern with entitlement. Those distinctions matter more than people realize. Life will always bring moments when support is necessary. There is no shame in that. The danger isn't asking for help. The danger is disappearing inside it. I tell this story because many people never notice when their voice fades. They adapt. They comply. They tell themselves it's temporary. And one day, they realize their life is being managed instead of lived. That doesn't have to be the ending. You can pause. You can reassess. You can reclaim authorship quietly, without permission, without conflict, and without apology. I did. And what followed wasn't freedom in the dramatic sense. It was steadiness, ownership, a calm that comes from knowing every decision ahead will be mine to make, mine to learn from, and mine to correct. This awareness didn't make me perfect or fearless. It made me accountable. Accountable to notice when I'm tired, when I want certainty handed to me, when I'm tempted to trade agency for relief. I learned to slow my yes, strengthen my no, and stay curious instead of compliant. The life I live now isn't louder, richer, or easier to explain. It's simply honest. Every choice carries my signature. Every mistake teaches me directly. Every success belongs to effort instead of permission. That honesty became my compass. It keeps me grounded when help is offered, when advice sounds convincing, and when pressure disguises itself as love. I no longer confuse urgency with importance or silence with peace. I choose presence, even when it costs comfort. That choice continues shaping everything I build, protect, and walk toward. That's the power no one can take unless you hand it over again. I won't.